Good afternoon. My name is Melissa Walker, and I am an Emerita Professor of History at Converse College. And I want to thank the folks at Cowpens, especially Ranger Virginia Fowler, for asking me to be part of the big celebration of the Battle of Cowpens in this strange new world where we're forced to do some things virtually that we used to do in person. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about the role of women in the American Revolution. The story of the Revolution is usually taught as a male story, but inevitably women were drawn into the war because, of course, the war came to them. It was here on their home territory. And as protest against the British mounted in the 1760s, everyone was forced to form political opinions. People acted on them willingly. Other people did not act unless they were forced to, but everybody had to take sides. And so women as well as men began to test their political voices. Women were sometimes bystanders, and other times they were historical actors, initiating action out of their own beliefs. Sometimes they were victims. They performed in several theaters, on the home front, on the political front, and on the battlefront. And I want to talk about all three. So let's talk about the political front first. One Southern woman wrote to another during the boycotts following the Tea Act that she and her friends, quote, commenced perfect statesmen in the wake of the act. In short, she meant that their boycotts of British tea were political acts, the acts of statesmen. The first political act of many women was to say no to the buying of British goods and the payment of British taxes. This started as early as the Stamp Act. For example, in New York City, a group of brides-to-be published a notice in the newspaper that they would not marry men who applied for a stamped marriage license. Women issued their own boycott statements. For example, in February of 1770, the Boston Evening Post carried the names of, quote, 300 mistresses of families, in which the number of ladies of the highest rank and influence had agreed to boycott tea. There were also women who published their political writings, often under assumed names or male pseudonyms. The poet Hannah Griffiths published poems criticizing Pennsylvania men who failed to enforce the boycott of British goods. Mercy Otis Warren of Massachusetts published satirical plays excoriating British officials. An anonymous verse published in the Boston Newsletter urged women to, quote, wear nothing but country linen, of economy boast. Let your pride be made the most to show clothes of your own make and spinning. In other words, don't wear manufactured cloth from Britain. William Tennant of South Carolina addressed the women of the colony in a newspaper article saying, ladies, you have it in your power more than all your committees and congresses to strike the stroke against the British by giving up the trivial pleasures of drinking tea. And perhaps most well known of these women's political actions related to the boycott were the Edenton, North Carolina ladies. In October of 1774, Mrs. Penelope Barker organized a group of 51 women in Edenton who formed an alliance wholeheartedly supporting the American cause against taxation without representation. These 51 women signed a petition proclaiming that they would boycott tea because they were, quote, determined to give memorable proof of their patriotism and could not be indifferent on any occasion that appears nearly to affect the peace and happiness of our country. It is a duty we owe, not only to our near and dear connections, but to ourselves. Now notice that these women are claiming patriotism as their own, and they're talking about their own political duties, their own patriotic duties. During the 1770s, Political resistance was pretty common, but an organized women's movement was not. And so the Edenton Tea Party shocked the Western world. It got written up, especially in British newspapers. From England in January of 1775, Arthur Idell wrote to his brother James describing England's reaction to the Edenton Tea Party. According to Arthur, the event was not taken seriously because it was led by women. He sarcastically remarked, "The only security on our side is the probability that there are but few places in America which possess so much female artillery as Edenton." The Edenton women were satirized in a political cartoon published in London in 1775. So even though the British were mocking and ridiculing the Edenton ladies, their actions were praised in the colonies. Now, most of this political expression by women takes place in the years before the outbreak of war. Women and men were expressing solidarity with the cause of protesting British tax policy. But the truth is that the burden of boycotting British goods fell most heavily on women. The most commonly imported British good was manufactured cloth, as I'd already suggested. And so when women boycotted British cloth, they had to weave the cloth themselves, an enormously time-consuming task. So as we turn from the political front to the home front, we first have to consider how the revolutionary ferment and the war itself altered women's daily work lives. Women interpreted their home front production in a very patriotic way. In 1774, a Connecticut woman named Abigail Foote recorded all the work done by the women and girls in her household in one day in her diary. She wrote, "Fixed a gown for Prude, mended mother's riding hood, spun short thread, fixed 2 gowns for Welsh's girls, carded 2, spun linen, worked on cheese basket, hatcheled flax with Hannah. We did 51 pounds apiece, pleated and ironed, read a sermon of Doddridge's, had 2 scholars from Mrs. Taylor's. I carded 2 pounds of whole wool and felt nationally." Now, let's just unpack that a little bit. She's mending gowns for people in her own household and for other people. She probably did that for a fee. She spun thread. She carded wool to prepare it for being spun. She worked on making a cheese basket, baskets that were used in home cheese making. She hatcheled flax, which involved taking kind of a club with nails nailed through it to beat flax plants so that they could get the flax fibers out that would be spun into linen. And she and another member of the household did 51 pounds of flax apiece. She pleated and ironed. She helped teach two children, that was having 2 scholars. She carded 2 pounds of whole wool, read a sermon, and she felt nationally. She's saying, I felt like a patriotic person doing all this work. Not only did women have to take on the work of producing manufactured goods that were once imported from Britain, but once the war began, they faced the challenges of shortages and inflation. They often had to do the work of their absent men, keeping farms and shops going. And all but the most elite women in colonial America did farm work, at least occasionally, field work. And now many women found themselves toiling in the fields regularly. They ran merchant establishments, and they even worked as printers, silversmiths, coopers, cut firewood, and negotiated the sales of crops, all in the absence of men. They also had to improvise household goods. Rural South Carolina women, for example, used thorns for pins. And many colonial merchants proved themselves to be less than patriotic. They hoarded goods in order to drive the price up, a practice that women protested. Abigail Adams reported that in 1778 in Boston, a group of 100 women marched on the warehouse of what she called an eminent, wealthy, stingy merchant who was gouging customers on the price of coffee. These women demanded the warehouse key, and he refused to give it to them. So one of them seized him by the neck and tossed him upon the cart. They seized the coffee and they left while, Abigail Adams said, a large concourse of men stood amazed, silent spectators. That's one of a number of such events in the historic record, where women attacked merchants and seized goods when they felt like these merchants were just holding on to them to drive up the price. Poor women in particular suffered. The Continental Army was not able to pay its soldiers regularly, and wartime inflation quickly consumed what wages were paid. So many poor wives and mothers became paupers, and some war widows were left destitute. Sometimes women wrote to their husbands begging them to come home to help feed the family. For women who lived in areas that were scenes of wartime fighting, home front life became perilous indeed. Armies from both sides occupied homes and demanded that women feed the officers. They destroyed fields, fences, furniture, barns, and even homes. They emptied storerooms, stole livestock and bedding and household goods, and they even carried off the enslaved people. Eliza Lucas Pinckney of South Carolina reported that she and her neighbors had suffered at the hands of the British. Our stocks, crops, boats, carts, all gone, taken, destroyed, and the crops made this year will be made very small by the desertion of the Negroes in planting and hoeing time, she reported. Eliza Wilkinson, the daughter of a wealthy Charlestonian whose husband was away in the army, reported on the British invasion of that city. She wrote, "I begged the inhumane monster who had my clothes to spare me only a suit or two, but I got nothing but a curse for my pains." The man even stole the buckles from her shoes and the doors and shutters from the house. They ripped up the family mattresses and smashed their furniture. Eliza wrote, "The whole world appeared to me as theater, where nothing was acted but cruelty, bloodshed, and oppression. Many women became refugees and fled their homes as the armies moved in, while others stayed to try to salvage what they could. Some women faced physical violence. Patriot militiaman William Gibson of South Carolina returned home in 1777 to find that his widowed mother had been tied up and whipped by a roving band of Tories, her house burned, and all her property destroyed. Women on the home front, though, often survived, but usually survived, and they often did more than that. Many of them played an active role in helping the patriot cause. Sometimes they did this in the women's sphere, in the domestic sphere, such as providing clothing for the army or volunteering to nurse the wounded when battles came nearby. They also raised money to help buy supplies for the army. For example, the Ladies' Association of Philadelphia was formed in 1780. And it was organized by the wives of two prominent patriots, Esther DeBert Reed and Sarah Franklin Bache. Both their husbands were patriots, and Bache was also the daughter of Benjamin Franklin. The goal of the Ladies' Association of Philadelphia was to collect money from women and girls that had once been spent on extravagant clothing. They urged the women to give up extravagant clothing because that was a mark of social status, and we were to be a country of equals. And this money could now be used to help the Patriot cause. The way they raised this money was that they divided up into small groups or pairs, and they went door to door collecting money. Over the life of their organization, they collected about $300,000 for the revolution, and they provided the inspiration for women in 4 more states, including Virginia and Maryland. One of the members of the Ladies Association reported that this effort offered proof that women could be patriotic citizens, but they were criticized by others. For example, Loyalist woman Anna Rowell wrote to a friend, "Of all the absurdities, the ladies going about for money exceeded everything." But they were praised by others, including the Marquis de Lafayette, who sent them a donation in honor of his wife. That's the actions of women on the home front, but let's talk about women on the battlefront. The women who were closest to the battlefront were the thousands of camp followers. That name has sometimes been used to refer to prostitutes, but actually camp followers were mostly desperately poor women who had no other options to feed their families except to pack up and follow the army. And they also would help provide services for the army. A woman named Hannah Winthrop noticed that most of the women with Washington's army in Boston were barefoot, clad in rags, and filthy. They carried everything they owned in huge packs on their backs, and they often had children in tow. Private Joseph Plum Martin of the Continental Army wrote, "A caravan of wild beasts could bear no comparison to these camp following women." But in the army, they received minimal rations and they were protected. As I said, they often provided domestic services for their husbands, but they also earned extra money by working as cooks, laundry women, and seamstresses. And sometimes they received wages for nursing services. George Washington complained, "The multitude of women, especially those who are pregnant or have children, are a clog on every movement of my army." And indeed they were. But as Washington admitted, they were also absolutely necessary. Not only did they perform important services, but he wrote that if he had to send them home, he would lose by desertion some of the oldest and best soldiers in the service. But camp followers were not the only women on the battlefront. Some women served as spies or couriers. For example, in early 1776, when the British were besieging Charleston, Harriet Prudence Patterson, a well-dressed matron, talked her way past British sentries and into the city, saying that she needed to buy medicine. What she actually was doing was carrying a message in her skirts for the American commander. Other women took up arms when their husbands fell in battle. One of the most famous of these is a woman that we know as Molly Pitcher, who actually was providing water to the Continental Army, and when her husband fell in battle, she took up his rifle. But often you will see this portrayed as she's firing a cannon. That's not exactly accurate, but she became famous for picking up her husband's arms and taking over his place in the Continental line. Another woman was Margaret Corbin. When her husband John enlisted in the Continental Army, she became part of the battalion of camp followers. And on November 16th, 1776, when the British and Hessian mercenaries mounted an attack on Fort Washington in northern Manhattan, John Corbin was on the cannon crew that was slowly being decimated by enemy fire. When at last John was killed, Margaret continued loading and firing the cannon until she herself was wounded by grape shot
which tore through her shoulder, chest, and jaw. She survived her wounds. She was treated and paroled by the British. That fort was captured. And she never fully recovered from her wounds. She was left without the use of her left arm for the rest of her life. In 1776, Pennsylvania granted her a $30 relief payment due to her condition, and she received a lifetime disability payment of half pay for a Continental soldier from the Continental Congress in 1779. So she's the first woman who received that kind of a commitment for her battlefield service from the new US government. She died in 1800, just prior to her birthday, and she was buried in the highlands above the Hudson River. And later she was reinterred with full military honors at West Point. Another woman who's involved in the fighting is Deborah Sampson Gannett. She enlisted in the American forces twice in the Revolution. The first time she called herself Timothy Thayer, dressed as a man, of course, and she got discovered and was sent home. But the second time she called herself Robert Shirtliff, and she served for 18 months until she was wounded and, of course, discovered that she was a woman. And she was eventually given an honorable discharge from the Continental Army. She went home to Massachusetts, married, had a family, and eventually received pensions from both the federal and the state governments. And she, in her later years, traveled around to Revolutionary War veterans reunions to talk about her experience. After her death, her husband received a widower's pension for his wife's service. Sally St. Clair dressed as a man and fought in the Continental Army until she died at the Siege of Savannah in 1782. There were also, of course, other women who in some way or another played key and pivotal roles in the Revolution, and many of them closer to the home front. Probably many people here in South Carolina have heard the story about Jane Black Thomas, who, when visiting her husband, who was imprisoned in the British fort at 96, overheard plans to attack Patriot forces at Cedar Springs in Spartanburg County. And she rode horseback, the story is 50 miles overnight, to warn those soldiers, who then were able to set a trap for the British troops they were actually loyalist troops who attacked them. And there's the story of Kate Moore Berry, who lived at Walnut Grove Plantation in southern Spartanburg County. And on several occasions, the family legend goes that she carried word to her husband, who was with Patriot troops, of impending British attacks and of the location of loyalist forces. So I think that one of the main takeaways from this is that women were playing very key roles throughout the Revolution. And I think and often they're doing this because they believe in the revolutionary cause. For example, you see this in petitions from loyalist women who try to maintain their property that has been confiscated after their husbands were arrested and exiled after the American Revolution, after the Patriot victory. For example, Margaret Brisbane was the wife of a loyalist who was a Charleston planter. And she pled her case to the state legislature after the Revolution to get her property back. She said, "When the House reflects on the weak and defenseless situation of women and children, who are not the promoters of the war, nor from their sphere in life can possibly be disadvantageous to the cause," in other words, we can't really hurt the cause, "and whose opinions seldom avail
on the judgment of men, when they recollect this and are informed that her sentiments with regards to the current contest never coincided with, but were always contrary to her husband's, that they will take that into consideration and extend benevolence to her by granting part of that property, which she once considered as her own, as the inheritance of her now destitute children. In other words, she is saying, I never agreed with my husband. He was a loyalist. I was a patriot. I opposed his views. And now you've stripped me of the property that I need to save my children from destitution. So she's proclaiming her right to have a political opinion. Margaret Brisbane, unfortunately, did not convince the legislature. She did not have her property restored, and she was ultimately obliged to join her husband in exile, and she had to leave behind the grown children from her first marriage. And before I leave, I want to say a final and quick word about Native American women who were here in the backcountry. And like everyone else, they are often forced to choose sides. In the South, the Cherokee tried to stay neutral and found themselves attacked by the Patriots again and again in 1776 and again in 1781. Cherokee women had a decision-making role, sitting in on council meetings and advising warriors and chiefs on policy toward the American Revolution. The Cherokee beloved woman, Nancy Ward, tried to negotiate a peace treaty with Patriot leader John Sevier, who was absolutely flabbergasted when she asked him to take the treaty home to his women and ask his women to ratify it. She asked him how he could possibly make peace without the agreement of the women. But in the wake of the war, many tribes lost territory and negotiating power, and women lost influence in the tribes as the new US government insisted on assimilation to its views of proper gender roles. So I think you can see from just these examples that women played very crucial roles in the American Revolution, especially here in the backcountry. And those roles have often been overlooked, but it's time to restore them to the historical record. Thanks for your attention today.